Hello, I'm Eric Greenleaf, and this is Healing from the Ground Up, a series of interesting conversations with exceptional people. Today our topic is Healing the Body Politic, and our guests are Norman Solomon and Dr. John Dyckman. Norman is an activist and author of War Made Easy. John, a psychologist in private practice and author of a book called Scapegoats at Work. And thinking about talking with you two, I was thinking with some sadness about our political society, which is, to my mind, full of all species of violence, from gun violence to family violence, to violence to our language and values, to our Constitution, and so on. And also, and inevitably, about the inequalities within that society. But I wanted to speak among the three of us, if we could, about what, if anything, can be done about the injuries to and deficits within the body politic, and a hard topic, to be sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I would say that illumination is a prerequisite. It doesn't solve problems, but if they stay sort of hidden away, then it's not possible to just shed light, as the saying goes. And when we use the metaphor of the body politic, we know, well, the human body, when there's not a vigorous circulation, then blockage happens. And I think that's true in the body politic. When you have blockage, which increasingly, but always has been a problem in the mass media, then you don't have vigorous flow of information, ideas, debate, and so forth. And you do have, well, the political social equivalent of serial coronaries. And I think we've had that, where if people can't connect and learn from each other and have a genuine sharing of information, then a sort of a short-circuiting of what should take place in a healthy body politic occurs.
I would agree. I think that there's another way to look at that, which is that every time you isolate, you have exaggeration and fluctuation. And you can actually predict or explain both of those phenomena, the exaggeration and fluctuation, from the single property of isolation. So I like Norman's analogy of serial coronaries, because I think we've had that in our body politic, and we certainly have those kinds of disjunctions in our interpersonal relationships as well. When you suggested this topic, I was trying to think, well, you know, if I really knew what to do, I wouldn't be talking on the TV station. I'd be out doing it, because I share the same kind of concern that both of you have expressed, and the sadness about what's going on. So I'd like to think about this a little bit in terms of how we deal with otherness in differences of opinion, and also within ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of the standard notion of projection, which we know is very real, hit me in the 1980s. I was going to the Soviet Union, and so each side would say how militaristic the other is. It's like, yeah, I'll say so. Yeah. And it's so common. And then in terms of violence, Eric, which you brought up early on, I mean, in our own particular era, there's the echo of what I grew up with as a teenager. We had President Johnson telling people who were burning down Watts or Newark, you know, you don't solve problems by resorting to violence. And this is the guy ordering the B-52s and the napalm to keep falling in Vietnam. And so, I mean, I'm not saying I was brilliant, but as a high school student, I got it. Hey, there's a disconnect here between do as we say, not as we do, sort of a dynamic. And you know, you fast forward 40 years, which is not exactly an elevating echo to recognizing, to hear that we have President Obama telling people that violence won't solve problems, whether in Arizona or in downtown, name your country, Cairo, don't resort to violence. And meanwhile, we have this tremendous escalation of war in Afghanistan. And I think there is a sort of an official cadence that is customary from our political authorities that, in effect, seeks to infantilize us, as though we don't have the cognitive capacity to to recognize inconsistency that's glaring of the sort that Orwell outlined in his book 1984. Just the essential contradiction that we should be able to say we see it, we intellectually and emotionally don't accept it.
There's an interesting corollary from developmental psychology. If you look at the development of empathy, the ability to take somebody else's point of view, and particularly someone else's emotional point of view. If you watch it with toddlers, first of all, the child just takes their own point of view and really pretty much ignores what the other kid is doing. Then a very interesting thing happens. The child, if Jimmy's grabs a toy from Tommy, Tommy starts to cry, Jimmy starts to cry. Mm. So Jimmy has taken Tommy's point of view, but he's lost his own. And it takes a little bit longer to be able to coordinate both points of view. In other words, to not lose your own, but to really be in the shoes of the other person. And that's the kind of isolation that you're pointing to that we're not getting. We're not getting that yet we're doing these different violent things. Why are we preaching nonviolence? There may be a rationale for it, but that has to be really acknowledged and explicated, and it's not being done.
This leads me to another sort of problem that may or may not have a solution, but the idea that we could be transparent and so on, sort of the WikiLeaks ideal, and the democratic or federalist ideal too, that the citizen be informed, have a vote, be represented, and so on. It seems to me, at least, to be running into the production of individual ideas through political advertising, so that the very people who formed the ideas of the electorate, let's say the Tea Party ideas, the Republican ideas, the Obama ideas, however you like it, are the same ones citing that as the people's will.
Having the authority or claiming some sort of overarching authority that we or they, so to speak,
sure.
embody.
Everyone wants dealing with the deficit. Everyone wants that first. Why do they want it first? Because that's all they heard on Fox News for 100
Well, the
weeks.
classic example, I was working on a book called Unreliable Sources in the late 1980s during the first Bush era, and we found stats where the public being asked, now how important is the drug crisis and the need for a drug war? And it was like 3%. And then the first President Bush holds up a baggie of some illicit drug at a White House news conference, and the numbers are going up 50, 60, 70% in the space of a day or two. I think in the contemporary era of 2011, if I can sound just a mite upbeat about some of our circumstance, certainly not the dominant assessment, but I think there are a lot of countervailing trends and tendencies where from the grassroots, including locally produced media and civic groups and engagement, and dare I say it, the Media Center of Marin, the independent media center in which we sit, there's percolation and continued growth of people who are trying to, in a decentralized, authentic, human way, sort out some of our problems and finding sort of a common space, a public space solution, which is embracing of diversity and affirming of our commonality. And it's not monetized, and it's not about just maximizing or even gaining profit per se, but then there are these dominant forces which are hugely corporate, tend to be propagandistic and mass media driven, and these are countervailing, and there's this sort of, I think of it as a lake in which the water may be moving in different directions at different layers.
That is an optimistic view.
Gee, I was really bummed by it.
Well, it depends on which layer you're
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah.
Oh, about the corporate and so on?
Right.
Yeah.
I guess since it's the nature of my work, I tend to look more for the individual solutions. I'm very eager to hear about group and societal solutions. But the kinds of things that seem to me really important is the ability to take the emotional position of the other And Baudelaire said that the devil's greatest trick was to convince us that he didn't exist. But I think the devil's greatest trick is to convince us that he exists outside ourselves.
Yeah, in the other guy.
In the other guy.
Yeah.
And that's the real problem with the body politic, or the interpersonal. I agree with you that there are moneyed interests that are pushing and have access to very important levers of power. But at I keep thinking on an individual level, what can we do? And what we can do is to try to understand what's motivating other people and understand why they're holding a particular position, instead of immediately being enraged by the fact that they're holding this position, trying to figure out, okay, well, from their point of view, what makes sense? How is it that they understand this?
And I guess in Norman's nice metaphor, there are layers of public discourse, at least after the shooting in Arizona, where people are saying precisely that. Well, we have to see the other person's point of view has validity too. Let's see how we can come together. We'll sit together in the State of the Union and so on. Not just a sort of etiquette of empathy and discourse, but the fact of it, if it can be arranged. So that does seem to me plausible. What would you guys think about sort of democratic policies like reinstatement of the draft, or a rule that you had to vote as ways of bringing the pool of opinion wider and deeper in the country?
Well, I don't know about compulsory voting, but reinstating a draft sort of reminds me of a dynamic we have going on now about public pensions of state employees, where publicity that some people are getting what we would call an adequate middle-class retirement package is enraging other people who don't have it. And so the choice is whether to say, well, gee, they're getting a decent pension. How dare they collect that pension? One can say, well, either bring them down or bring the rest of us up and raise the floor. And to militarize the society further with an effort to say, well, then it'll be more egalitarian, I think is dubious. It's more just to ratchet up what Martin Luther King Jr. in 1967 called the madness of militarism. And also, as we know, having, I think, all of us living through that era, there was a conscription law in the late 60s, not exactly equitably applied. I think just more broadly, and this goes to the point of the individual and trying to heal individually, which I think is crucial. We always need to do that, and empathy is crucial, is that the paradox is that that is very real and important, but none of us only live individual lives, whether it's pollution, global warming, commercial assault, unemployment, all sorts of environmental degradation, violence in our society. Even if we wanted to heal individually only, there are these macro forces that are emotionally, physically, culturally assaulting us.
Oh, I agree completely. The question is, how do you act? And each person has to act individually. You can act in concert with other people, but we don't have the power to snap our fingers and make these other things go away.
It's never snap fingers, but imagine being black, or as the time called it, a Negro in the South in the early 1950s. Some of the pain was living under Jim Crow.
Absolutely.
And it was only by working together that that greater pain could be alleviated.
I'm not making an argument against group action. I'm just saying that group action alone tends to be polarizing. It's very important to be careful in group actions, that there's a respect toward other people.
Oh, totally.
And there's an example from family therapy that's an interesting one. And I don't know if you remember that abortion was at one point people were coming to blows in Boston about it. And cars were being burned and people's houses were being trashed. And some family therapists in Boston were really concerned about this, and they started trying to have dialogues between leaders, particularly the women, who were opposed to abortion, and women who were in favor of a woman's right to an abortion. And these involve having tea together, and then, you know, sort of coffee clatches, and then dinners. And while it didn't change the positions of either group, it vastly improved the quality of the dialogue in terms of people understanding where the other person was coming from, seeing it as a human response and then an expression of someone's values, rather than this person is trying to do something to me.
Well, Gandhi talked about, as he put it, there being some truth all around the table, that everybody has some parts of the truth. And I think that to try to be cognizant of that and have that change how we are with each other does mean ratcheting way down a sense of self-righteousness or accusation. And then on the one hand, it seems we want to avoid just accepting things the way they are without attempting to change for the better. But on the other hand, we don't want to resort to violence of some sort. And I think Dr. King had a very nice phrase. He talked about creative tension, that he wanted creative tension. And in a sense that polarization can be positive if it's done within a nonviolent context to stir the waters in a creative way.
Well, you're talking about a country that has a history of violence, founded on violence, and in some sense, violence enshrined in our Constitution. And so I think there are really some important concerns raised by that, because while I would agree with that ethic of maintaining the creative tension, I think we also have to find a way to have that tension contained. And one of the strongest forces that I can find, both individually and also when I try to talk politics with people who I don't agree with, is curiosity. And that if I can maintain curiosity, it tempers my own impatience, it tempers my own righteousness. And it becomes what Bateson called a kind of double description. I'm holding my position, I'm trying to understand their position, and together it makes a kind of binocular vision that might lead to real depth in our discussion, in our perception, and perhaps in the solutions we can come up with.
And there is something that you're both reminding me of in an emphasis on the intrapsychic and interpersonal, the individual conversation, and societal movements like Gandhi's, that Hannah Arendt wrote about, that big societal changes came about through the self-organization of small groups. So the committees of correspondence in the Revolution, the women's groups in the 70s, and so on, might be a vehicle for the kind of, let's say, application of healing to the rawness of people's harm to each other. And in the kinds of political work you do, for example, there are the formation of small groups.
Absolutely.
And they're not always people who agree on every item in the agenda, I'm sure.
Oh, an example comes to mind. I mean, I was involved for 2 years, a nonviolent campaign in the late 70s in a Gandhian civil rights tradition to shut down an operating nuclear power plant. This was near the Oregon plant. And I was in what we called an affinity group, which was a small group of 8 or 10. Well, there were people there from the Catholic Worker who, when we were in jail together, would read the New Testament, which was, I mean, I was reading Louis L'Amour because that's what was in the cell when I arrived, you know, but I picked it up rather than the Bible. You know, but it goes to your point that we don't have to agree on everything, but we find that common bond. And I think in the longer term, if we can, in a sense, disabuse ourselves of our own lack of knowledge, because it's the openness to realize that not only do we have a lot to learn that's factual, but we have some assumptions about other people which actually are injurious to us understanding who and how they are and really live. And it recalls something I think attributed to Will Rogers and or Mark Twain. It's not what people know. He says it this way: it's not what people don't know, that bothers me. It's what they know that just ain't so.
Mm-hmm.
And all of us
so
know
again,
things that ain't so.
Yes,
Again,
Lord
you
help
would-
us,
Yeah.
save us from the true believer.
Yes.
Yeah. So you would argue, both of you, for, and I too, of course, for some sort of openness in the circulation system, so that other ideas, other emotions that come with empathy or compassion, other notions that are historical too. It's not like we invent everything, you know, according to the morning paper. And there are men and women who've done remarkable things with very little support. And Gandhi, initially one of them, and others we could name, who, by some sort of force of feeling for others, led people against violence or against terrible policies or situations.
Well, the point of empathy that you make, I mean, that's really crucial to who we, I think what Darwin said, conscience is what distinguishes humans from other animals, and empathy is right there.
Although the relation between empathy and conscience actually is a funny and not particularly linear one. That's a very complex field.
But empathy itself is perhaps not linear per se.
Oh, you bet, you bet. And it is a joint function, but then you have people who can understand other people's emotions very clearly, but they really don't care. And we call them sociopaths. And
but you wouldn't call that empathy.
I would call it a type of empathy.
But it's a
yes,
sort of a through the
it's
mirror
a knowledge,
funhouse, or
well,
distorted empathy.
and it's a knowledge of the other person's feeling.
It's empathy without compassion.
Without
it registers what
compassion.
the feeling
That's
is, but
right.
doesn't care.
Right, and the notion is that unless someone responds to you as a young person with some concern, some change in their feeling because of your feeling,
Yeah.
you're not likely to develop this. And fortunately, most of us, it doesn't take a lot. It can just be a neighbor who does it. It doesn't have to be your parents. It could be a coach. It could be somebody else. But that your feeling has to produce a change in their feeling, and you have to see that in order to really develop that.
What do you think about the efficacy of a president or another elected official demonstrating feeling and empathy in the famous I feel your pain?
Work for Clinton.
Yeah, but that's that's a projection of it, which sort of begs the question of what are the actions that actually are responsive to other people's pain in a helpful way. And I'm afraid that statements of feeling pain are limited. If somebody, in other words, if I am in distress and somebody's action or inaction is contributing to my distress and pain, and they say they feel my pain, it sort of goes to your earlier point, then at a political or personal level, it's of very little use to me if they don't...
Quite agreed, yeah.
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 But if let's say we could stitch together genuine feeling and political leadership, where the felt pain leads to a changed policy, let's say.
Now you're cooking.
Now you're cooking.
Yeah.
You guys both like that.
I thought we had it. I read The Audacity of Hope, Obama's book, and I thought, at last, not only somebody who can make a coherent argument, but someone who has emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And so I worked hard for him, and I thought this would be something a lot better than it turned out to be. And there are a lot of reasons why, a lot of historical reasons why he was sort of hamstrung by the mess that was left to him. But I'm still waiting for that kind of, to see that same depth of emotional intensity. We saw it around during the campaign about racism, when he responded with a really spectacular speech that was both feelingful and rational. And that's the combination that I would love for us to have in our political discourse.
It was a great speech in Philadelphia about race. I think that the governance then adds many more burdens that are substantive rather than, of course, rhetorical. And in a nutshell, I think it's such an imperative to implement a single standard of human rights And that is very difficult when you look at the actual policy choices and the flack that will come if you do implement that. For instance, a Palestinian child and an Israeli child, their lives being equally precious in policy as well as rhetoric.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I guess the unanswered question is how can that be affected in people who are making strategic decisions and balancing political whatnots and leading armies and so on, because the individuals may be very decent people. The policies may be injurious to hundreds of thousands of people. And then, at least to me, it feels like a gulf between those two. Because I bet a lot of politicians, being sort of decent enough people as family people or as friends or as co-workers, it would be nice if they were also decent people in policy terms. Anyway, I wish we could keep on talking, but thank you very much, both of you, for coming. Thank you all for watching, and we hope you'll join us again on our continuing series, Healing from the Ground Up. I'm Eric Greenleaf. Thanks for watching. So, thank you both.